All right. Well, guys, I'm excited. We have our pastors panel. We're getting here set up for just a second. And I decided I got the short stool because I was short. I might need to put it up on the step. I don't know. I think I'm just not tall enough to get on the tall one. So, well, we are. You got enough room over there? All right, I'll scoot back a little bit. We are excited to be able to share with you a couple of the different urban legends and half-truths that we haven't quite been able to capture. There's so many that are worthy of talking about. And as I was talking with these guys, and I said, we're trying to keep to a certain time limit. People want to go to lunch, and Phil said, yeah, well, preacher's trying to condense. That's like a miracle in and of itself. So we're each going to share a little bit and maybe interject, ask a question or two, and see kind of what we come up with here. And so, Elle, I'm going to have you start us out, and you are covering Everything Happens for a Reason.
So everything happens for a reason. I think this is actually a rather ironic myth because I'm not convinced the phrase itself is inaccurate. Like so many other things, this rises and falls on our interpretation. Interestingly, I have found that it is most often those who appeal to our inability to reasonably understand why things happen who also use this phrase liberally. They say everything happens for a reason, and then this is often followed by, but we just don't know why. We don't know what that reason is. And I find that less than compelling. Now, to be fair, we probably need to take a good look at causality, or cause and effect. When we do this, we find that most everything does indeed happen for some reason. Let me give you an example. I really wanted that to be louder. There is a sort of not loud stomping noise today in the sanctuary. Do you know why that happened? We heard a sort of not loud stomping noise today because I stomped my foot in the sanctuary. That's the reason. Now, recognizing that things happen in nature and in our lives and in the world for a reason is not the same as assigning some sort of divine providence to every occurrence. I don't really feel inclined to tell you today that God ordained it that I would stomp my foot and it wouldn't be loud enough in the sanctuary. This was not divine providence. It was just something that happened. And I want you to hold on to that because we are going to circle back. But first, we need some more Ecclesiastes. In chapter 3, Solomon writes, there's an opportune time to do things, a right time for everything on the earth. A time for birth and another for death. A time to plant and another to reap. A time to kill and another to heal. A right time to destroy and another to construct. A right time to cry and another to laugh. A right time to lament and another to cheer. A right time to make love and another to abstain. A right time to embrace and another to part. A right time to search and another to count your losses. A right time to hold on and another to let go. A right time to rip out and another to mend. A right time to shut up and another to speak up. A right time to love and another to hate. A right time to wage war and another to make peace. The Message version, which I just read, is very interesting because it speaks of a right time, whereas many other translations speak just of a time or even a season. Sometimes things just happen because they do. Sometimes it's because of the natural progression of life or because there's a realistic expected consequence or because there are legitimately random occurrences in the world. The last line in the first sermon I ever preached was, "It is what it is, and it is good." I thought this was fairly clever, but what about when whatever it is isn't good? We have to keep in mind that just because things happen does not mean they should, or that God has preordained or predestined these things as a part of some bigger plan. Many people have found comfort in the idea that particularly bad things have special purposes, and this is not to say that God cannot squeeze good from any and every situation. God certainly can do that even when others intend those situations for evil, and we see this as evidenced by the story of Joseph in the biblical narrative. But God is more powerful than to need death, war, rape, abuse, and tragedy to make good on covenantal promises. God certainly does not will or cause these evils in the world in order to prove a point or create the context for some greater good. So does everything happen for a reason? Maybe not in the ways in which we have so often assumed. Certainly, many things have a cause, but what we do next with whatever our circumstances might be is much more open-ended. In situations of pain and suffering, the very first thing we should do is to look for ways to comfort those who are hurting. Because although I believe wholeheartedly that most everything can be redeemed, it's also true that time, space, and presence are more valuable for genuine healing than explanations and cliches.
Thanks, Elle. Appreciate that. I think what I really love in that explanation, I'd heard a podcaster not too long ago who doesn't have, his faith isn't, I say faith, it's not like a faith career, but they, are a person of faith, and had made a response that everything happens for a reason. And I wanted to respond, everything can be redeemed. It's not that everything happens for a reason, but God can redeem anything that happens in our lives. And that's, I think, sometimes more helpful to say that God can redeem this. This tragedy that you're going through, or this, death of a child, or loss of, whatever relationship, God can redeem that. And that feels so much better than, well, I'm sure there was some purpose that God needed that child.
Agreed.
So I think for me, I can kind of wrap my mind around, okay, there's things that God does and God causes, and then maybe there's things that God didn't do or cause that somebody else did or caused. But then when I get to the random stuff, that's where it really starts to make me go, how do I deal with this? So I guess that would be my question is, how do I deal with just that randomness?
Thanks for the softball question. So, random things are difficult. I think that we often hear people say things when there is a natural disaster. There's a hurricane, there's a tsunami, there's an earthquake. And you will hear people say, oh, well, God hated that city, so that's why that happened. And I think we just need to come to the realization that that's not what's going on. God is not sitting somewhere far away from us thinking, really don't like that one down there, so, zap, I'm going to do this thing. There are random things that happen in nature, in our world, that cannot be accounted for as something that happens for some divine purpose. But I think that what's really important in that is, again, when we see the suffering and when we see the hurting, not to necessarily jump in and look for the explanation and look for the reason, but to come alongside the people who are in pain and to be a part of community and to be a part of the healing process.
Absolutely. Thank you. Thank you. Now, Phil, you are tackling, it doesn't matter what you believe as long as you're sincere.
Right. Was an interesting one. I think it can get a little upside down. As I first thought about this, I was thinking that I might expect that this kind of myth or urban legend, half-truth, it might be expressed, or we might usually expect it to be expressed by people who are not concerned with what a person believes. Just be sincere, don't worry about your belief. Maybe that'd be people outside the church or people that don't believe in God and so forth. Beliefs aren't important, just be sincere. But as I thought more about it, I thought that actually we kind of find this inside the church or among those who do believe in God just as much, if not more. It just sounds a little different. It sounds something like, theology isn't important, just be a sincere Christian. So one might expect that to dispel this half-truth or myth, I might say, it doesn't matter how sincere you are, because you can be sincerely wrong. All that matters is what you believe. Believing the right things is what really counts. Well, not quite. Jesus actually had some things to say about this, I think. And for example, on one occasion, Jesus was speaking with the rule followers of the day, the Pharisees, and apparently Jesus was in a kind of tell-it-like-it-is mood because he said this, as recorded in Matthew 23. "But woe to you, scribes and Pharisees, hypocrites, for you lock people out of the kingdom of heaven. For you do not go in yourselves, and when others are going in, you stop them. Woe to you, scribes and Pharisees, hypocrites, for you cross sea and land to make a single convert, and you make the new convert twice as much a child of hell as yourselves." And then he goes on to say, "Woe to you, scribes and Pharisees, hypocrites, for you tithe mint, dill, and cumin, and have neglected the weightier matters of the law, justice and mercy and faith. It is these you ought to have practiced without neglecting the others. You blind guides, you strain out a gnat, but swallow a camel." Tell us what you really think, Jesus? Notice Jesus calls the Pharisees multiple times hypocrites. Now, being a hypocrite is precisely the opposite of what it means to be sincere. When you look up sincere in the dictionary, this is what you find. You find that it means it's marked by genuineness or true, and that sincerity means honesty of mind and freedom from hypocrisy. So sincerity and hypocrisy are definitely opposites. So Jesus is calling out the Pharisees not because their belief is wrong, because technically speaking their beliefs are right, but because they are insincere and hypocritical. And I think this is important because it shows us that sincerity matters to Jesus a lot. So this would seem to back up the part of the claim, as long as you were sincere, right? Sincerity does matter. But sincerity is not the only thing that matters. What you believe matters too, because we have to be more than technically right to be sincere. This is why Jesus tells the Pharisees, you should have practiced the latter, justice and mercy and faith, without neglecting the former, the technical details of the law. It's both and, not either or. Now, one more thing that I think is really important to this discussion is this. Belief isn't just about thinking rightly or orthodoxy. It is also just as much about acting rightly, what we'd call orthopraxy, and loving rightly, what we would call orthopathy. So my answer to it doesn't matter what you believe as long as you are sincere is this. Theology matters. Beliefs matter because beliefs are not only about what we think, but what we say and what we do and how we live and how we love. In short, practice what you preach. It does matter what you believe because what you believe is what enables you to be sincere.
So my question to you would be, I tend to be an overcorrector. So, no one is surprised. So when you see Jesus speaking to the Pharisees, the teachers of the law, I think we have to recognize that their beliefs are right beliefs. They have our Old Testament scriptures memorized. We still believe these things are true. The tendency to overcorrect is to say, so we won't worry so much about any of those beliefs and any of those truths, but we'll just make sure that we're out doing the right thing. How do we account for that, and how do we really make it both and, as opposed to, well, this was the wrong way, so now we're going to do it another wrong way?
Sure. I think if we look to Jesus' example and what he speaks of, particularly in the Sermon on the Mount, okay, Jesus says he doesn't come to abolish the law or the Old Testament, but to fulfill it. And so it's not we get rid of one and we have this new law. We just exchange them one for the other, but that we understand the depths of the law. And that's why he will say, you have heard that it was said, you've heard that it was said, do this, do that. And he'll say, but I say, not only this and that, but also this. Or instead of, well, not instead, but also. And backtrack, right? But so I think when you look at that, I think that is part of kind of the consistent ethos of what Jesus says. It's the same way here in Matthew 23. He doesn't say, no, 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 don't go tithe, don't go following all those rules and regulations, just do this, just be merciful. He says, no, you should have practiced the latter, being merciful and just and faithful, without neglecting the former.
So we have to do it all.
Oh, she's going to push further, isn't she? All right. So I would say yes and no. Isn't that a great answer, right? That's a good way to wiggle out of it, yes and no. I think what Jesus does is Jesus shows us that there is more to this than the letter of the law. There is the spirit of the law. And I think that's what Jesus is pushing it towards. So what you believe does matter, but that sincerity of spirit also matters.
But it's kind of like, it sounds like Jesus is saying, you've missed the point. I've given you all these things to help direct you and help, teach you how to be sincere and how to do your life. And they said, okay, well, I can check. And it just doesn't reflect in their life. And it's, missing the point.
That we get hung up on these little
Yeah.
details. And it's not that we don't need to know those details or that they don't matter. It's just that Jesus is looking at the big picture.
Yeah. Yeah. Cool. Thank you. Thank you. And these tensions, these wrestlings, is part of why these are tough urban legends and half-truths. And first service, they decided they were going to continue this conversation over lunch, which I think he took as an invitation and she took as a chance to overcorrect, perhaps. I don't know. But we said we need to do a session later where we'd put the pastors on the hot seat, have some lunch, and then grill. Well, I'm going to run into mine here, and mine is faith can fix anything. Of all of the urban legends and all the half-truths that we seek to conquer, this one I think can really stump us. It's one of those that sounds so good. It sounds like, oh, I'm being a really great, honest Christian, and I'm doing the things that I'm supposed to do. And we ask, what could be wrong with this statement? Where have I missed the boat? We are certainly called to have a strong faith, to have a faithful faith, if you will. And so we believe that the purpose of our faith is to do these sorts of things, that God will reward us for our faithfulness. And we read texts in Scripture like faith as small as a mustard seed can move a mountain. And with God, all things are possible. And these Scriptures are so filled with hope. They motivate us, they challenge us to have this greater faith and this deeper faith and to really invest fully in the miraculous. Perhaps calling us to believe if we have just enough faith, God can fix whatever is broken in our lives. That our faith is powerful enough to change anything in our lives. And indeed, our faith is powerful, and God seeks restoration and wholeness in each life. But I want to point out two things about this. First, I want to make my umbrella statement, my caveat here. I believe that we serve a God of the miraculous. From raising the dead to healing paralysis, to giving sight to the blind, to casting out demons, there are tangible miracles that were witnessed by those who were closest to Jesus. In the 2,000 years since, many others have occurred. Our God is big enough. Our God is great enough to do the miraculous, and I believe firmly in that God. And there have even been times that we have witnessed healings and life course corrections even in modern day. But the flip side of this, when we push it to its logical conclusion, when we keep pushing a little bit further, we begin to believe that God will fix everything and anything that we encounter. I should say our faith. That's the important distinction here. It leads us to believe that we have to attain a certain level of faith in order for God to pay attention to us, or that we have to put a certain amount in order to receive that same amount of gain. It's like if I have a level 3 faith, then my faith can fix level 3 problems. If I have a level 8 faith, then my faith can fix level 8 problems. Or to say it another way, it can cause us to believe that if God has not fixed whatever is broken in our lives, we simply haven't expressed big enough faith. We haven't removed all doubts. We haven't visualized positive results. We haven't been all in or been or done enough. And that has the potential to be quite damaging. I'll give you a couple examples. I had friends of mine that had the good fortune of adopting a boy at a young age who, unfortunately, due to some complications, had severe disabilities and needed special care throughout his life. And he lived this beautiful, joy-filled life surrounded by a gracious and loving family and friends. You know what the crazy part is? On more than one occasion, someone said to them, if you just pray harder, God might heal him. If you just lean on your faith, certainly God will heal him. God will make it better. God will perform a miracle. As if these parents hadn't already been pouring in every ounce of energy and faith and prayers into their little family. To say your son isn't being healed because you haven't prayed hard enough hurts. To say that your tumor isn't smaller because you haven't had great enough faith is harmful. And quite frankly, it's not true. Similarly, I encountered a psychiatrist a few years back, friend of a friend sort of a deal. And as we're doing general introductions, he finds out I'm a pastor, which always leads to interesting results. And you want to stop a conversation real short, tell somebody you're a pastor. And so he says to me, this is wonderful. He said, faith is so important to the healing process. He says, I counsel inpatient and I counsel outpatient, and I always tell my patients, you should have faith. Because faith will heal you. Faith will keep you from having anxiety or depression. Faith will fix that. And as a person of faith who has wrestled the majority of her life with some sort of mental illness, to put it nicely, it stung. And I will say, later on, we will have a sermon, at least if not a sermon series, on dealing with mental illness and faith. It's a vital conversation the church needs to have. But what he was indicating to me was that my faith was not strong enough to beat it. That in some way or another, I had failed. And isn't that what we're saying when we buy into this myth? That if our kid's not being healed, we've failed. Or if we can't kick anxiety or depression, we've failed. Or if our cancer isn't in remission, we've failed. If chronic illness isn't relieved, if an estranged child won't call, if we didn't land our dream job, we've failed. Fill in the blank with whatever brokenness you're dealing with. And if it isn't fixed, the story that this urban legend is telling us is that somehow we have failed in our faith or we haven't done something right, which couldn't be further from the truth. And see, here's the thing. Here's where we've missed the mark. The purpose of our faith is not to fix our problems or to give us an easy life without complications. God's not a magician. God's not a short order cook waiting to hear our requests or working to give us a life that's perfect or to resolve things that we don't like. There are things in life that we get to deal with, that we grow from, that wound us and occasionally break us. And things that will remain something that we have to deal with for the entirety of our lives. Here's one thing my psychiatrist friend got right. He said faith is vital to the healing process, to this process that we call living. While having enough faith or deep enough faith or a faith that never doubts is not a guarantee of the type of healing we're requesting, faith can and will and does give strength for each day. It helps us manage, it helps us cope, it gives us a bigger picture, it forces us to look outside of ourselves, and ultimately it moves us to come to understand that our God is mysterious and wonderful and good and seeks to make us whole. All right, what you got for me?
Well, I'll tell you, it's really interesting, I think, when we look at the myth that Allison tackled and the one that Elle did, because you have, on the one hand, you have, well, faith can fix anything, and then it becomes all about us. If we have to do it all, if we don't do it, we're the failure. It didn't work out, and then on everything happens for a reason. It kind of becomes, well, it's all about God, because God just preordains everything, and if it didn't work out, well, that's God's fault. We can blame God because there must have been a reason. And interestingly, I would say that those two work together because the God that we serve is a God who wants to work cooperatively with us, who chooses to do that. There are some things that God does, and there are some things that we do, but it is about both God and us working together to bring about the kingdom. At least I think that's interesting that those two play together like that.
Yeah, it balances out.
Yeah, I think too, as we dispel these myths and look into the ways that we can work with God cooperatively, this also helps to strengthen our theology, to lead us to the right beliefs that lead to the right practices and the right heart. And something in the helping professions, like the number one rule is do no harm. And as we can look at some of these myths, urban legends, folk religion type things that we have bought into, and help people to break those down so that they can see which things are true and which things are not true about this God who loves us so generously and who wants to cooperate with us in the work of redemption, in the work of all things being redeemed. I think this just helps us to have a more solid footing for those foundational beliefs.
Yeah, absolutely. And I love that we use the passage from Ecclesiastes as our starting scripture, and you referenced it. And the special that was shared right before our panel time it's called Over the Sun by Shane and Shane. And it's this conversation with Solomon, the one who is going through Ecclesiastes, and they're trying to understand, like, what's going on? Why is the world so messed up? Like, what meaning have you found in all of this? And Solomon's response, it says, Solomon, wisest one, tell me what you've found under the sun. Have you figured it out? Tell us why it works. And Solomon answers, get over the sun. Get a higher vantage point. Move beyond your own earthly understanding. Most often, life doesn't make sense to us. Most often, and that's part of it. If we understood everything, we would lose our need for God and our need for our faith. Hebrews 11, faith is the conviction of things not seen. It is, in a way, an acceptance or a confidence in that which we don't see. Realizing that God's ways are bigger than ours, beyond ours, and we have to do our best to live under the direction of the mysterious. Thanks for joining me, guys. I appreciate it. Thanks. This was fun. Amen for all of us, and let us stand for our closing hymn.